Don't worry, Ashford, it's low threat, perfect for someone who just answers phones. Garrett Kane dropped the assignment sheet in front of her like it was trash, laughed loud enough for the whole room to hear. 20 soldiers watched. Nobody spoke. Kira picked it up, folded it once, slid it into her vest pocket without blinking. Kane had no idea he had just signed the death warrants of 10 enemy snipers. He had no idea the woman he humiliated in front of everyone had been trained since age 6 by the most feared marksman in military history. He had no idea she was already reading the terrain that would become his worst nightmare. Nobody did. If this story hits you the way it hit me, subscribe to this channel and follow Kira's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. FOB Liberty sat in a bowl of dust and noise and controlled tension. The kind of place where everything looked organized on the surface and felt like it was one bad decision away from falling apart underneath. The mountains pressed in from 3 sides. The wind came in from the 4th, carrying grit that worked its way into everything: your food, your gear, your teeth. Soldiers moved in the particular way of people who had stopped noticing the discomfort, because the discomfort had simply become the air they breathed. Specialist Kira Ashford moved through all of it like she wasn't quite there. That was the word most people used when they tried to describe her afterward in the debrief rooms, in the mess hall conversations, in the quiet moments of honest reflection that only happen when something has already gone very wrong and you are trying to piece together how you missed something so obvious. She was quiet. She was calm. She answered questions with precision and asked very few of her own. She kept her equipment in perfect order, her reports submitted on time, her communications protocols followed without deviation. She did her job. She did it well. And somehow doing it well had made her invisible. In a place built on visible strength, on the language of rank and volume and physical dominance, a woman who spoke softly and carried a radio was not someone most people looked at twice. She was background. She was infrastructure. She was the voice on the other end of the line that told you your signal was clear. Sergeant First Class Denise Calloway, the senior NCO who had processed Kira's original assignment to FOB Liberty, once described her as steady. It was meant as a compliment. In the context of a communications unit, steady was exactly what you wanted. Steady meant you could count on her. Steady meant she wouldn't crack under pressure. Steady meant she would be there when you needed her. What Denise hadn't been able to see, what nobody had been able to see, was that Kira Ashford's steadiness was not the steadiness of someone who had never been tested. It was the steadiness of someone who had buried something so deep inside herself that it no longer showed on the surface, but it was still there, waiting. She had been at FOB Liberty for 11 months when Garrett Kane arrived. He came in with the kind of energy that certain men carry into rooms, the energy of someone who has always been the most capable person in every space he has occupied and has long since stopped questioning whether that assessment is accurate. He was a SEAL, decorated, experienced, and absolutely certain of the hierarchy of things. SEALs at the top, support personnel somewhere below, communications specialists, the ones who didn't carry rifles into the field, somewhere below that. Kira registered his arrival the way she registered most things. She observed it, cataloged it, and filed it without visible reaction. Kane noticed her exactly once on his first day, long enough to ask someone what she did, hear the answer, and move on. She was communications. She answered phones. That was all he needed to know. The man who watched all of this with considerably more attention was Master Chief Donovan Brennan. He had been at FOB Liberty for 3 months before Kira arrived, and in that time he had developed the particular stillness of someone who had learned that the most important information on any base was never in the official briefings. It was in the way people moved, in the silences between conversations, in the things that nobody said out loud because they hadn't yet figured out that they were worth saying. Brennan had 41 combat deployments behind him. He had seen more versions of what a soldier could be than most people would encounter in a lifetime. He had learned in the particular school of hard and irreversible experience that genuine capability was almost never loud. It announced itself in the smallest ways and details, so quiet they were easy to miss if you weren't paying the right kind of attention. He had been paying that kind of attention to Kira Ashford for 11 months. It started the day she walked into a terrain briefing she hadn't been required to attend. She had slipped into the back of the room, stood against the wall, and watched the topographical maps with an expression of focused, almost clinical concentration that didn't match the role of someone who just needed the communications coordinates. When the briefing officer pointed to a ridge system and described it as low coverage, Kira's eyes had moved to a different point on the map, a point no one had indicated, and stayed there for 3 full seconds. Brennan had seen it. He had said nothing. 2 weeks later, she had walked past a group of SEALs running a field assessment exercise. She hadn't stopped walking, but her eyes had swept the layout of the exercise in a single glance, moving across elevation, points, cover positions, and angle of approach in the precise sequence that a trained tactical mind would use. It took her maybe 2 seconds. Then she was past them and gone. Brennan had been watching from the doorway of the operations building. He had turned around and walked back inside without saying anything to anyone. He had gone to his footlocker that evening and taken out an envelope. It was sealed with a wax stamp that had been pressed by a hand he hadn't seen in 4 years. He held it for a moment, then put it back. Not yet. The sealed letter had come to him through channels that didn't officially exist, passed from one trusted hand to another across the distance of years and geography, in a grief so large it had reshaped the man who carried it. Marcus Ashford had written it 3 weeks before his final mission, in the knowledge that he might not come back, and in the certainty that what he had built in his daughter could not be allowed to stay buried forever. He had sent it to Brennan because Brennan was the only man he trusted to know when the moment was right. Brennan was still waiting for that moment. In the meantime, he watched, and he worried, because the thing about Garrett Kane was not simply that he was arrogant. Arrogance in Brennan's experience was almost universal in environments that rewarded aggression and punished vulnerability. You learned to read it, to work around it, to manage it. Arrogance was a known quantity. Kane was something more specific than arrogant. He was the kind of man who had organized the world into categories and then used those categories to justify every decision he made. If you were in the right category, Kane would run through fire for you. If you were in the wrong category, you didn't exist as a full person in his mind. You existed as a role, a function, a problem to be solved, or an obstacle to be moved. Kira Ashford was in Kane's organizational system of function: communications, support, background. And when Kane needed someone to fill a slot in the forward relay assignment that he would not have asked his own team to fill, he put her there. The day he made the announcement, Brennan was standing 12 feet away. He watched Kane drop the assignment sheet. He watched him laugh. He watched the room react, and he watched Kira not react. And he felt something cold move through his chest that he recognized as the particular chill of a man watching a mistake being made in slow motion and knowing he cannot stop it yet. He wanted to say something. He said nothing. Because Brennan had learned over 41 deployments that sometimes the thing you cannot prevent is also the thing that becomes necessary. He did not like that lesson. He had paid for it in ways he would carry until the day he died. But he had learned it, and he could not unlearn it. He walked over to Kira after the room had cleared. She was looking at the assignment sheet. Her expression was as always composed, but her eyes were doing something different. They were doing the thing he had watched them do at the terrain briefing and during the field assessment exercise. They were reading, processing, moving across information in a sequence that wasn't random and wasn't casual. She was reading the terrain description of the forward relay position. "Ashford," he said. She looked up. "Master Chief, you comfortable with that assignment?" She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, something careful and measured. That was also, he noticed, something very old, something that had been living in her for a long time and had learned not to show itself. "It's an assignment," she said. "I'll execute it." "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The terrain profile doesn't match a low-threat classification." He waited. "The valley described in the relay coordinates has 3-sided elevation dominance." She said, her voice as even as if she were reading off a communications protocol. "If I were choosing a position for a coordinated engagement, that would be it." Brennan studied her for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching, without elaborating, without asking him to do anything with what she had just said. "Put that in your comms report," he said finally. "I did?" she said. "Yesterday, it was routed to Garrett Kane." He felt the cold feeling again, deeper this time. "And?" He didn't respond. She folded the assignment sheet again and put it in her vest pocket. "I'll execute the assignment, Master Chief." She walked away. Brennan stood in the empty briefing room for a long moment. Then he went back to his footlocker and took out the envelope again. He turned it over in his hands. Not yet, he told himself, but soon. Sniper Ethan Burke was the second person on the base who sensed something wrong. He had a different kind of intelligence than Brennan, less analytical, more intuitive, the kind that lived in the body and expressed itself as the hair rising on the back of your arm without clear reason. He had learned to trust it years before he could explain it, and he had stopped trying to explain it to people who hadn't developed the same thing. He came to Kira on the evening before the convoy mission, not officially, not as part of any briefing, but with the informal directness of someone who had something to say and was choosing to say it. "You filed a terrain report," he said. She was running a diagnostics check on her radio equipment. She didn't look up. "2 days ago." Kane buried it. "I know." Burke leaned against the equipment rack and studied her. She kept her attention on the radio, moving through the diagnostic sequence with the precision of someone who had done it thousands of times and was doing it now partly because it needed doing and partly because having her hands busy gave her something to look at that wasn't him. "What's your actual read?" he said. "Not the official one." She paused on the diagnostic sequence, just briefly. Then she resumed. "Overlapping fields of fire from 3 elevated positions," she said. "Vehicles would be channeled through the valley floor with no viable exit options on either flank. Communication disruption would be the first priority. They'd hit the relay positions before the convoy entered." Burke stared at her. She glanced up, saw his expression, looked back at the radio. "I've been on bases a long time," she said. "You listen to enough terrain briefings, you start to understand the patterns." "That's not what that was," he said. She didn't answer. "Ashford." "I filed the report, Sergeant Burke," she said. "I did what I could do." He was quiet for a moment. "If you were right about the terrain, I filed the report." Her voice was still even, still composed, but there was something underneath it that he heard clearly, something she hadn't quite managed to bury as deep as everything else. It sounded like grief. "If something happens out there, it won't be because I didn't say something." He left her to her diagnostics. She finished them and sat alone in the quiet of the equipment room for a long time after that, looking at nothing. Her hands still. She was thinking about her father. Marcus Ashford had a way of teaching that had nothing to do with formality and everything to do with attention. He did not set up drills and announce them as drills. He would simply begin moving through the world in a particular way and expect her to follow, to watch, to understand. On a hiking trail, when she was 9 years old, he had stopped without warning and said, "Tell me what's wrong with this hill," and waited without prompting, without impatience, until 8-year-old Kira had looked at the hill long enough and carefully enough to see that the shadow pattern on the north face didn't match the sun angle and that something had moved the brush near the top recently. She hadn't known at 9 that she was learning to read a sniper's position. She had known only that when she found the answer, her father looked at her with something so specific and so bright in his expression that she had wanted to find that look again every day for the rest of her life. He had called her his best student. He had said it with the pride of a man who meant it completely and the sadness of a man who understood what he was doing to her by meaning it. He was building something in her that the world was going to ask her to use eventually, whether she was ready or not, whether she wanted to or not. She had been 17 when he deployed for the last time. She had been 17 when they brought the flag to her mother's door. At the funeral, her mother had held her hand and said nothing for a very long time. Then she had said, "Promise me you won't let this world take you the way it took him." She had said it quietly, without drama, without anger. Just a woman who had loved a man and lost him to the particular hunger of a world that consumed capable people without ceremony. Kira had promised. She had meant it completely. She had enlisted in communications 9 months later, choosing the role with the precision of someone who was making a deliberate decision about what they would not allow themselves to become. She would serve. She would contribute. She would not pick up a rifle. She had kept that promise for 7 years. She sat in the equipment room and listened to the base settle around her into the sounds of night, the generators humming the distant percussion of activity from the perimeter, the wind bringing its eternal load of grit against every surface. She thought about the valley. She thought about overlapping fields of fire and elevation dominance and the particular silence that a terrain falls into when it is waiting for something. She thought about the convoy that would leave in the morning. She thought about her mother's hands holding hers at the funeral. She put her father's voice in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept things she needed to not hear for a while, and she went back to the base housing, and she slept the way she always slept, lightly, precisely in the way of someone whose body was still, even after 7 years oriented toward the possibility that something would come in the dark. At 03:47 in the morning, Master Chief Brennan sat up in his bunk and took out the envelope and held it in the dark for a long time. He thought about Marcus Ashford. He thought about the conversation they had in a forward operating base, in a different country, in a different decade over coffee that tasted like it had been brewed with determination rather than beans. Marcus sitting across from him with the particular stillness that Brennan now recognized in his daughter. "I built something in her," Marcus had said. "Something real, something that doesn't go away." He had looked at his coffee. "She's going to need it one day, whether she wants to or not." "Then why did you let her walk away from it?" Brennan had asked. Marcus had been quiet for a moment. "Because her mother needed her to, and her mother was right." He had looked up. "But the world doesn't care about right, Donovan. You know that better than anyone." Brennan knew that better than anyone. He put the envelope back. He lay down. He did not sleep. In the morning, the convoy loaded. The morning briefing was professional and precise and covered everything except the things that most needed covering. Kane ran it with the efficiency of a man who had made his decision and was not interested in information that complicated it. Kira sat through the briefing and said nothing. She had said what she had to say, in writing, through proper channels. She picked up her radio equipment and her sidearm, and she prepared to execute her assignment. And as she walked toward the vehicles, feeling the weight of the morning around her and the weight of something else she couldn't name pressing at the edges of her composure, she passed close to Ethan Burke. He was checking the scope on his rifle. He didn't look up, but he said very quietly, "If I'm right and you're right, stay close to cover and stay on the radio no matter what." She kept walking. "Ashford," he said. She stopped. He looked up at her then, and in his expression was something she recognized, not quite certainty, but the thing that lives just next to it, the thing that trained instinct produces when it is reading a situation correctly and knows it and wishes it were wrong. "If it goes bad," he said, "do what you need to do." She didn't answer him. She got in the vehicle. The convoy moved out at 0600. The valley waited. The convoy moved out of FOB Liberty at 0600 exactly. And Kira counted the vehicles the way her father had taught her to count everything that mattered, not by number, but by weight, by spacing, by the particular rhythm of engines that told you something about how ready the people inside them actually were. 3 MRAPs, 1 command vehicle, 2 supply trucks, 22 personnel, including herself. The valley was 40 minutes out. She sat in the second vehicle with her radio equipment braced between her knees and her sidearm holstered at her hip, and the assignment sheet still folded in her vest pocket, though she no longer needed to read it. She had memorized the coordinates within 30 seconds of receiving them. She had memorized most things within 30 seconds. It was not something she advertised. Corporal Danny Reyes was driving. He was 23 years old and from San Antonio, and he talked when he was nervous, which meant he talked constantly in the field, a steady low-level commentary on everything he observed that most people tuned out after the first few minutes. Kira had never tuned it out. She had learned early that people who talked when they were nervous were also people who noticed things they didn't know they were noticing, and if you listened carefully enough, you could extract actual intelligence from the stream. "Roads seem clear," Reyes said. He didn't say it like it was good news. He said it the way you say something that should be good news but doesn't feel like it. "Yeah," Kira said, "like really clear. We passed 2 villages and I didn't see a single, I don't know, kid, dog, anything." "I know." Reyes glanced at her in the rear view. "That bother you?" She looked out the window at the terrain moving tums. The road had narrowed. The elevation on both sides had begun its slow, certain rise, the land organizing itself around them, in the way she had read on the map, the way she had written in her report, the way she had lain awake in the night thinking about. "Keep your eyes on the road," she said. "Yes, specialist." She keyed her radio and ran a quick check of all convoy frequencies. Everything was operational. She filed the status and watched the sides of the road and thought about the word her father used to use for this feeling, the feeling of a landscape that has stopped it being neutral and started being something else. He called it weight. He said terrain acquired weight when it was being used, when someone had looked at it carefully and decided it served a purpose. This terrain felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds per square meter. She keyed the command frequency. Convoy actual, this is Ashford at comms 2. I'm reading complete civilian absence along route for the last 6 kilometers. Recommend Schwarm. Noted Ashford. Kane's voice. Flat dismissive with the particular texture of a man who has already made his decision and is only half listening to everything that comes after it. Maintain your position and keep the frequencies clear. She released the key. Reyes heard the exchange. He said nothing, but his hands shifted on the wheel and Kira saw it. Keep driving, she said quietly. At 06:38, 38 minutes into the mission, Master Chief Brennan was standing in the operations center at FOB Liberty, watching the convoy tracker on the main screen. He had been there since 05:45, which was 15 minutes before he was required to be, which was not unusual for him and which nobody had remarked on. He watched the 6 vehicle icons moving along the digital representation of the route, and he felt the weight of the sealed letter in his footlocker pressing against something in his chest from 40 meters away. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Mitchell was also in the operations center. He was a careful, precise man who had earned his position through a combination of genuine competence in the particular political intelligence required to survive in command structures at his level. He trusted Brennan's instincts more than he admitted. He had never said so directly. He didn't need to. Brennan had been reading the language of command for long enough to know when his judgment was being quietly relied upon, even by men who officially outranked him. Convoy's on schedule, Mitchell observed. Yes, sir, Brennan said. Kane ran a solid brief this morning. Yes, sir. Mitchell looked at him. You have something, Master Chief? It was not a question. Brennan considered his response for a moment with the care of a man who has learned that the way you introduce information shapes how it is received. Ashford filed a terrain assessment 2 days ago, he said. It wasn't actioned. Mitchell's expression shifted, just slightly. Kane reviewed it. He received it. A pause. Pull it up. Brennan pulled it up. The room was quiet while Mitchell read. Kira's assessment was not long. It was precise, organized, and written in the flat professional language of someone who had trained themselves to present information without emotion because they had learned that emotion made people stop listening to the content. She had identified 3 primary elevation points, 2 secondary positions, the channeling effect of the valley floor, and the communications vulnerability of the relay position itself. She had not speculated about intent. She had simply described what the terrain said if you read it correctly. Mitchell read it twice. She's communications, he said. It wasn't a challenge. It was the kind of thing you say when you're processing a discrepancy. Yes, sir, Brennan said. Where did she get the tactical terrain analysis? Brennan was quiet for exactly 1 second. She's observant, sir. Mitchell looked at him again. Longer this time. He had the instincts of a man who had been dealing with Brennan long enough to recognize when the Master Chief was giving him a partial answer and choosing not to push on it. Get me Kane on comms, he said to the room. At 0641, Kira felt the road change. It wasn't a physical change. The surface was the same packed dirt it had been for the last several kilometers. It was something else. A quality in the air or the particular way the sound of the engines bounced off the rising terrain on both sides, or the angle of light or some combination of all of these things that her body processed faster than her conscious mind could articulate. Her hand moved to her radio before she knew she was reaching for it. All convoy elements. This is Ashford comms 2. I am... The first shot cracked. It came from the left ridge, high, maybe 340 meters. And the sound of it was wrong, not the sharp, random crack of a reactive shooter, but the precise, controlled sound of a weapon fired from a stable position by someone who knew exactly where they were aiming. Reyes hit the brakes. Contact left, someone screamed on the command frequency. Contact left, elevated position. Then the second shot, right ridge this time. Different elevation, different angle, and that was when Kira's brain completed the calculation. It had been running for 40 minutes and arrived at a number that made her stomach drop straight through the floor of the vehicle. Not 1 shooter, not 2. She keyed her boy. Command, this is Ashford. I am reading coordinated fire from multiple elevated positions. This is not a patrol engagement. Repeat, this is not a patrol engagement. I count at least. The 3rd and 4th shots came almost simultaneously. then the fifth, and the sixth, and the command vehicle's front tire exploded. The convoy stopped moving. That was when Kira understood completely and without any remaining doubt that the valley had been waiting for them. Reyes had the presence of mind to pull the MRAP as far left as the road allowed, which was not far. The elevated terrain pressed in from both sides, and the valley floor gave them nowhere to go that wasn't already covered by someone up high. She could hear Kane's voice on the command frequency giving orders with the mechanical efficiency of training taking over from whatever shock had existed in the first seconds. But she could also hear what the orders were accomplishing, which was very little because the vehicles were channeled and the shooters were elevated, and the geometry of the situation was exactly what she had described in her report 2 days ago to the man who hadn't read it. She counted shots. She counted intervals. She counted angles. 10 shooters, minimum. Probably exactly 10 because the fields of fire were overlapping in a way that required specific positioning and specific spacing, and 10 was the number that made the geometry work. They had planned this. They had planned it carefully. This was not an ambush in the opportunistic sense of the word. This was a constructed elimination. Someone had looked at a map, identified the valley, identified the relay assignment, and built a trap around the specific vulnerability that the assignment created. They had positioned 10 trained snipers at intervals that covered every possible exit and every possible cover position on the valley floor, and they had waited for a convoy to walk into it. Ashford, Reyes was pressed against the inside of his door, his sidearm drawn eyes on the windows. "What do we do?" She was already on the radio. "Command Ashford, I need air support status, immediate." Static. Then Kane's voice tighter than she had ever heard it, the dismissiveness scraped away by something more honest and more frightened underneath. "Air support is unavailable. Weather window closed at 0620. QRF is 45 minutes out." 45 minutes. She processed that number the way her father had taught her to process numbers that felt impossible not as a wall, but as a parameter. You didn't get to change the number. You worked within it or you didn't work at all. "What's current SEAL element status?" she said. A different voice came on Sergeant First Class Holloway, calm, in the way of someone who has been in bad situations long enough to develop a functional relationship with them. "2 elements are pinned behind vehicle 1 and 3. Burke's position?" A pause. The specific terrible pause of someone receiving information they don't want to transmit. "Burke's been hit. He's down near vehicle 3. Status unknown." Kira's hand went still on the radio. Ethan Burke, who had told her to do what she needed to do. "How bad?" she said. "Unknown," Holloway said. "He's not responding on comms." She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them. "Reyes," she said, "give me your rifle." He stared at her. "What? Your rifle? Now." "Specialist, your communications, you don't—" "Danny." She said his first name, which she had never done before, and the sound of it cut through the noise of everything around them and landed exactly where she needed it to. He looked at her. She held his gaze with an expression that was for the first time since anyone at FOB Liberty had known her not composed. It was not frightened either. It was something different, something older. "Give me the rifle." He gave her the rifle. She checked it in 4 seconds. Military habit so deeply encoded, it happened below the level of conscious thought chamber magazine, safety scope. The scope was adequate, not what she would have chosen. Adequate. She looked at the door. The distance between the vehicle and the position she needed to reach was approximately 30 meters of open ground. To the left. The fire from the left ridge had been consistent in its intervals, which meant the shooter there was disciplined, which meant he was following a pattern, which meant the pattern had gaps. She counted. 14 seconds between shots from the left position. She had been counting since the 3rd shot. The variance was less than a second. Disciplined, professional, and therefore predictable. "When I move," she said to Reyes, "you stay in this vehicle. You keep your head down and you keep the engine running. You hear me. Where are you going?" "And I need to reach Burke's position." "That's 30 meters of bomb. I know what it is." She put her hand on the door handle. She listened to the shooting. She counted. "Don't follow me." "Ashford." She pushed the door open and she moved. 30 meters. She had run longer distances on worse terrain, in worse conditions and training exercises. that her father had designed with the specific intention of teaching her that distance was a conversation between your body and the ground, and that the only way to survive the conversation was to commit to it completely. She committed. The left ridge shooter fired. She had already used the gap. She hit the ground behind the vehicle 3 with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs and lay flat for a second, pulling air back in, listening, assessing. The shooting continued. Nobody had targeted her specifically. She was communications. She was background. She answered phones. Burke was 3 meters from her. She crawled to him. He was alive. She confirmed it with her hand on his neck, his pulse beneath her fingers strong and fast and real. He had taken her round to the upper shoulder left side, not a kill shot, but he was down, and he had been positioned behind his rifle when he fell, and the rifle was still there. She looked at it, her father's rifle. She had known when Ethan Burke arrived at FOB Liberty, and she had seen the weapon that it had been Marcus Ashford's. She had not let herself look at it directly after the first moment. She had filed it away in the same place she filed everything that she could not afford to feel. She had been very disciplined about not looking at it. She looked at it now. It was a Macmillan TAC 338, long-action fluted barrel suppressor ready. Her father had had modifications made to the stock 17 years ago that fit the specific geometry of his shoulder and his arm length, and the particular way he settled into a firing position, a position that he had described to her once as coming home, like your body recognizing a place it belonged. She had the same geometry, same shoulder width, same arm length. He had noticed that when she was 12 years old. He had said quietly, almost to himself, "You were built for this." And she had not known then what to do with that information, and she had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to decide whether it was a gift or a sentence. She reached out and picked up the rifle. The weight of it landed in her hands like a memory. And everything inside her that she had spent 7 years packing down and sealing shut and walking away from opened up like a door coming off its hinges, not violently, not explosively, but completely. Training, instinct, the 1,000 hours of her father's voice in her ear, the geometry of distance and wind and breath, and the moment between heartbeats when everything aligns and the world holds still. Just long enough. It was all there. It had been there the whole time. She settled into position behind the rifle and she found her first target. Left ridge, 340 meters. She had estimated the distance from the vehicle, and she confirmed it now through the scope reading the position with the automated certainty of a mind that had never stopped being able to do this even when the rest of her was pretending otherwise. The shooter was in a good position. He had chosen well. He had cover on 3 sides and a clean line of sight to the valley floor, and he had been firing with the discipline of a professional for approximately 9 minutes. He had not been expecting someone to find him. She controlled her breath. In the operations center at FOB Liberty at 0651, the convoy tracker showed 6 stationary vehicles and a communications signal that had gone partially dark. Brennan was on his feet. Mitchell was on the radio to Kane. The exchange was not productive because Kane was operating in a situation that had moved beyond the parameters he had planned, for which were not extensive. "He's pinned," Mitchell said, lowering the radio. "How many shooters?" Brennan said. "He can't get a count. Too many positions." Brennan stared at the tracker. Ashford's signal went mobile. Mitchell looked at the screen. The small indicator that represented Kira's radio had moved from the second vehicle's position. It had moved toward vehicle 3. It had stopped. "She went to Burke," Brennan said almost to himself. "Burke's down," Mitchell said. "I know." They both looked at the screen. Brennan thought about the envelope in his footlocker. He thought about Marcus Ashford sitting across from him with bad coffee and the particular expression of a man who has accepted something large and difficult about the future. He thought about a 12-year-old girl on a hiking trail identifying a sniper's position in a shadow pattern on a hillside. "Sir," he said. Mitchell looked at him. "When this is over," Brennan said, "I need you to read something." Mitchell held his gaze. "What kind of something?" "The kind that explains what's happening out there right now." The first shot came from Burke's rifle at 0652. Nobody in the valley understood where it came from immediately. The sound was suppressed. Not silent suppressors were never silent, but shaped differently than the incoming fire coming from a position that the enemy snipers had assessed as occupied by a wounded man and had therefore deprioritized. The left ridge shooter went down. There was a pause in the firing pattern. 3 seconds. 4. The kind of pause that happens when professionals realize that something has changed in the geometry of their situation and they need to reassess. Kira was already moving to the next calculation. 380 meters, right ridge, secondary position, slightly lower elevation than the first. The shooter there had been using the cover of a rock formation that was good cover from the valley floor, but had a gap on the northwest angle that you would only see if you were positioned where she was positioned. She found the gap. She found the shooter. She fired. On the command frequency, Holloway's voice cut through the chaos with the sharp edge of someone processing something he didn't have a category for. Did someone just take down 2 ridge positions? Kane's voice tight and strange. Identify the shooter. Someone identify the unknown shooter. Silence on the frequency. Then Reyes from the second vehicle, his voice doing something that nobody had heard from Danny Reyes before, something quiet and almost reverent. It's Ashford, he said. It's the comms girl. She's shooting. Complete silence on the frequency. Then Kane said, that's not possible. And Kira lined up her third shot. 290 meters. North Ridge, third position. The shooter there had made a small adjustment. After the first 2 went down, he had shifted his position by approximately 2 meters to the east, which was the correct instinct, which was what a trained man did when he realized he was being engaged by someone who could read his position. But 2 meters was not enough when the person reading his position was doing it the way Kira was doing it, which was not by guessing, but by understanding the logic of where a man in his situation would go, because her father had taught her to think like the target, not just aim at it. She adjusted. She fired. 3 down, 7 remaining. On the valley floor, the SEAL elements had registered that something was changing in the pressure of the incoming fire. 2 positions had gone completely silent. A third had just gone silent. The geometry of the trap was developing holes, and trained men could feel that even before they fully understood it. Sergeant First Class Holloway pressed himself against the wheel well of Vehicle 1 and listened to the changed pattern of fire and said to the man next to him quietly and with absolute sincerity, someone is hunting them. The man next to him, a SEAL named Torres, who had 8 years of combat experience and a healthy skepticism towards statements that sounded cinematic, said, from where Vehicle 3. Torres processed that. Burke is down. I confirmed it. Another pause in the incoming fire as another position went silent. Torres said very quietly, then who, back at Phobe Liberty? The tracker showed Kira's signal stationary at Vehicle 3, and Brennan stood in the operations center, watching the convoy tracker and listening to the fragmented communications from the valley, and doing the math in the way of a man who has known something for a long time and is now watching it become real. Mitchell was talking to someone on the command line, but Brennan had stopped tracking that conversation. He was tracking the pattern of what was being reported from the valley positions going dark one by one, the incoming fire thinning, the chaos beginning to organize itself around a new and unexpected variable. He thought about Marcus Ashford saying she's going to need it one day whether she wants to or not. He thought about the envelope in his footlocker. He thought, Marcus, you knew exactly what you were building. At 7:19 minutes after Kira had picked up her father's rifle, the incoming fire from the right ridge dropped by half. 4 positions were silent. The convoy elements had stopped retreating and started assessing. Torres had moved to a covered position from which he could actually observe the valley's geometry, and what he was seeing was not possible by any standard framework he possessed for understanding battlefield dynamics. Someone was taking down enemy snipers, one at a time, methodically. From Vehicle 3, "Command, this is Torres," he said on the radio, his voice carrying the very specific texture of a man reporting something he cannot fully explain, but which is undeniably real. "I am observing precision fire from Vehicle 3's position, eliminating enemy sniper positions in sequence. Targets at 343, 82, 90, and most recently 420 meters have been neutralized. Fire is suppressed, controlled, and consistent with trained long-range engagement." A long pause on the command frequency. Then Mitchell's voice from FOB Liberty, replacing Kane's on the command channel, which told Kira everything she needed to know about what had changed in the operations center. Torres confirmed. "Shooter location is Vehicle 3. "Yes, sir." "Confirm shooter identity." Torres looked across the valley floor to Vehicle 3. He could see the rifle barrel, steady and precise. He could see nothing else. I cannot confirm from my position, sir. Reyes's voice came in before anyone else could speak. Command, this is Reyes at Vehicle 2, I can confirm. Shooter is Specialist Kira Ashford, comms specialist. She went to Burke's position and she picked up his rifle, and she has been engaging since approximately 0652. The silence that followed was longer than the previous one. Kira was not tracking the radio. She was tracking her fifth target. 440 meters. The hardest shot she had taken so far. The position was at the far end of the valley's left ridge, at the edge of the coherent engagement range. And the shooter there was the most disciplined she had encountered. He had adjusted his position twice after the others went down, and he was now using cover that was genuinely good, the kind of cover that forced you to work for the angle rather than finding it. She worked for it. The wind had shifted 2 degrees in the last 4 minutes. She had felt it on her face before she had registered it consciously. She adjusted. She waited. The shooter moved to reposition. Just slightly. Just enough. She fired. 5 down, 5 remaining. Burke stirred beside her. She heard him before she saw him, a sound that was not quite a word, the sound of a man returning to consciousness through pain into a situation that was significantly different from the one he had left. She kept her eyes on her next target position and said without moving the rifle, "You're hit in the shoulder. You're going to be okay. Don't move." A pause. Burke's voice rough and confused, and then as he processed what he was hearing, what he was feeling, the absence of his rifle in his hands, something different. Something that moved rapidly from confusion to understanding to an expression that she couldn't see but could hear in his voice when he spoke again. "Ashford," he said. "Yes." "Are you yes?" Another pause. "How many?" he said. 5 down, she said. 5 remaining. Don't talk." He didn't talk. She engaged the 6th position. In the operations center at FOB Liberty, Mitchell had stopped talking on the command line. He was standing in front of the tracker screen with his arms crossed in an expression that Brennan had seen on senior commanders before, the expression of a man recalculating every assumption he has been operating on and discovering that several of them were wrong. "Brennan," he said without turning. "Sir? That thing you said you needed me to read." "Yes, sir." Mitchell turned. His expression was not angry. It was something more complex than angry, the compound emotion of a man who is recognizing that he has been operating with incomplete information and that the incompleteness was not accidental. "You knew about Ashford." Brennan met his gaze. "I had reason to believe she had significant capability, sir." Significant capability. Mitchell repeated the phrase with the flatness of a man trying it on and finding it inadequate. "She's taken down 6 enemy snipers from a covered position under fire using a weapon she was not assigned and has not, as far as this command is aware, any training with." "She has training," Brennan said, "just not in any record this command has access to." Mitchell stared at him. "The letter," Brennan said, "when this is over." Mitchell turned back to the screen. On the valley floor, Kane had moved from the command vehicle to a covered position behind Vehicle 4, and from that position he could see Vehicle 3, and from Vehicle 3 he could see the rifle barrel moving in the slow, precise way of something alive and purposeful. He had been on that frequency when Reyes confirmed the shooter's identity. He had heard the name. He was a man who prided himself on rapid adaptation, on the ability to incorporate new information and restructure his tactical picture without ego getting in the way. He was discovering that this particular piece of new information was larger than his usual capacity for rapid adaptation. He had humiliated her in that briefing room. He had looked at her and seen communications. He had seen the slot he needed to fill. He had seen, if he was honest, someone he didn't need to think about. He watched the rifle barrel move to its 7th target. He heard the shot. He heard the silence from another position on the ridge. 7 down, 3 remaining. Kane did not speak on the radio. He pressed himself against the wheel well of Vehicle 4 and watched the rifle barrel and felt something move through him that he did not immediately have a name for. He arrived at the name after a moment. It was shame, clean, uncomplicated, and very large. Kira was not thinking about Kane. She was thinking about Position 8, 270 meters. The shooter there had done something smart after Position 7 went down. He had stopped firing completely. Understanding that firing was giving away his location, trusting that his cover was sufficient to make him invisible if he kept still. It was the right instinct. It was what her father would have called a survivor's instinct, the recognition that staying alive sometimes required doing the thing that felt like passivity. But keeping still was not the same as being invisible. She found him anyway, not by muzzle flash, not by movement, by shadow. The sun had moved 11 degrees since she had taken her first shot, and the shadow pattern on the north face of the ridge had shifted with it, and there was one shadow that had not shifted correctly, one shadow that was attached to a mass that had not moved when everything around it had moved. Her father had shown her that trick on a hiking trail when she was 9 years old. She fired, 8 down, 2 remaining. Burke said beside her, his voice clearer, now the shock beginning to organize itself into something functional. Ashford, the last 2 are going to run. I know, she said. Can you get them if they run? Depends on which direction. He was quiet for a moment. Then you should know something. That rifle it belonged to. I know whose rifle it is, she said. Silence. How long have you known, he said. Since you arrived. She moved to the 9th target position. I recognized the stock modification. Burke was quiet for a very long time after that. The 9th shot came at 07:14, 22 minutes after the first shot had cracked across the valley. 22 minutes of sustained, methodical, and visible precision from a position that the enemy had assessed as out of the fight, from a shooter that the entire base had assessed as communications, from a woman who had promised her mother she would never pick up a rifle and had spent 7 years making good on that promise. 9 down, 1 remaining. The last shooter broke. Burke had been right, he ran. He broke from his position on the left ridge and moved at a diagonal going for the high ground behind the ridge itself, which was the correct decision if the person shooting at you was a competent marksman working within standard engagement parameters. Kira was not working within standard engagement parameters. She had been taught by a man who said that running is just a different kind of stillness, that a moving target is predictable if you understand why it's moving, and understanding why it's moving tells you where it's going, and where it's going is where you aim. She aimed where it was going. She fired. The valley went silent. Complete and absolute silence, the kind that arrives after sustained noise. The way darkness arrives after a light goes out, not gradually, but all at once with a totality that is almost physical. Kira kept the rifle in position for 30 seconds. She counted. No movement, no fire, no sound except the wind, and somewhere down the valley, a vehicle engine running at idle. Then she exhaled. She became aware in the way that the body returns to itself after extreme focus of multiple things, simultaneously the ache in her shoulder from the rifle's recoil, the rawness of her elbows from the ground, the sound of Burke's breathing beside her, uneven but present alive. The radio on her hip was making noise. Several people were talking on several frequencies. She should respond. She knew she should respond. She looked at the rifle in her hands. 10 targets, 18 minutes. She had done what her father would have done. She had done the thing she promised she would never do. She lay with her face very close to the ground, and she breathed, and she held both of those things at the same time, the way you hold 2 things that cannot coexist and yet must, because the world does not offer you the option of having only one be true. Burke's hand found her arm. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand there, and she felt the weight of it, and she stayed very still and breathed. On the command frequency, the voices were multiplying. Mitchell's voice from FOB Liberty came through above the rest, carrying the authority of a man who has made a decision about how to hold something he doesn't yet fully understand. All convoy elements, this is command. Confirm status. Holloway's voice. Elements are intact, sir. I count 9-10 enemy positions neutralized. Valley is clear. We need medevac for Burke walking wounded on 2 others. All vehicles operational except command vehicle front axle. Copy that, Mitchell said. QRF is 20 minutes out. Medevac is behind them. A pause. Confirm Ashford's status. Reyes answered before anyone else could. His voice was doing something that Kira would not have been able to describe, but that everyone on the frequency recognized the sound of someone bearing witness to something they did not have prior language for. Ashford is at vehicle 3, sir. She's okay. She's got Burke. They're both okay. Another pause. Then Mitchell said, with a quietness that was different from his usual command voice, quieter and more careful, good. Tell her to hold her position. He lowered the radio. He looked at Brennan. Brennan said nothing. Mitchell said, "Get me that letter." 19 minutes after the last shot. 19 minutes in which the valley had held its silence like a thing that had been broken and didn't know yet how to reassemble itself. The medevac came in 3 minutes behind the QRF, and the sound of the rotors cutting through the morning air was the first sound that felt like it belonged to the living rather than to everything that had just happened. Kira had not moved from Burke's side. She had kept her hand on his shoulder, not the wounded one, the right one, and she had monitored his pulse at irregular intervals, the way her father had taught her to monitor things that mattered not by clock, but by feel, by the continuous low-level attention of a body that understood what it was looking for. His pulse had steadied in the last 10 minutes. The bleeding had slowed. He was going to make it. She knew that the way she knew terrain, not by hope, by assessment. When the medics came over the ridge of the valley and reached Vehicle 3, the first one threw a young woman named Castillo with the efficient movements of someone who has run toward wounds too many times to waste motion, stopped for a fraction of a second when she saw Kira. Not because of the rifle, because of the expression on Kira's face. It was the expression Castillo would say later of someone who had done something they could not undo and was only now beginning to understand the full dimension of that fact. "He's stable," Kira said before Castillo could speak. "Round interdod, the left shoulder didn't exit. He's been conscious for approximately 11 minutes. Pulse was irregular at first, corrected in the last 8. Castillo looked at her, then at Burke, then back at her. "You a medic?" "No," Kira said. "You assess like one." Kira didn't answer that. She stood and moved back from Burke's position to give the medics room, and she held the rifle at her side and stood in the silence of the valley and let the world reorganize itself around her. Torres was the first SEAL to reach her. He came around the Vehicle 3 and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment the two of them just looked at each other, the decorated combat veteran with 8 years of hard experience, and the communications specialist nobody had looked at twice, and something passed between them that didn't require words. He had watched her work. She knew he had watched. He knew she knew. "You're Ashford," he said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man confirming something he has already accepted as fact. "Yes," she said. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the ridge. He looked back at her. 10 positions. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said with a directness that she recognized as the highest form of professional respect available in environments like this one. "Who trained you?" She held his gaze. "My father." Torres waited. She didn't elaborate. He nodded once slowly in the way of a man who has filed something and will return to it. "Good shooting," he said. He walked away. She watched him go and felt the weight of the rifle in her hand and thought about her mother and the funeral and the flow and the particular quality of silence in a room after a promise has been made. At 07:38, Garrett Kane came around Vehicle 3. She saw him before he saw her, which was habit, and also something she had not been able to turn off since the moment she picked up the rifle. Her situational awareness had opened up completely, the way a hand opens when it stops holding something tightly, and she was now registering everything in her immediate environment with a clarity and a completeness that she had not allowed herself in 7 years. She saw Kane approaching, and she did not move, and she did not adjust her expression, and she stood precisely where she was and waited. He stopped 6 feet from her. He looked different than he had in the briefing room. Not smaller. Kane was not a man who became physically smaller under any circumstances. But there was something missing from him, some outer layer that had been stripped away by the events of the last hour, and what was underneath it was something more honest and more uncomfortable. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. He opened his mouth, and she waited for whatever he was going to say, and what came out was nothing she had predicted, because what Garrett Kane said in a voice that was stripped of every quality that had made it intolerable in the briefing room was, "I buried your report." She said nothing. "2 days ago," he said, "you filed a terrain assessment. I read it. I decided you didn't know what you were talking about." He paused. "I was wrong." The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the silence of something real, which is almost never comfortable. "3 people are wounded," she said. Her voice was even. It was always even. But this time the evenness cost her something visible. He could see it cost her, and she let him see it because she was done managing what he saw. "Burke almost died." "I know." I filed that report through proper channels because that is what I am supposed to do when I identify a threat. I did my job. I know, he said again. You didn't do yours. It landed the way the truth lands when it is stated plainly by someone who has earned the right to state it not as an attack, not as cruelty, but as a fact that occupies the room without apology and waits to be acknowledged. Kane did not flinch from it. Whatever else he was not a man who flinched from things, and this Kira thought was perhaps the only quality she had ever respected in him without reservation. No, he said, I didn't. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked away. She watched him go and felt something in her chest that was not satisfaction and was not forgiveness and was not anger either. It was something quieter than all of those things. It was the feeling of a bill being acknowledged that could not be paid. At 07:45, Master Chief Brennan arrived with the QRF. She saw him coming across the valley floor, and she did not move to meet him. She waited the way she had learned to wait for things that were going to happen regardless of whether you moved toward them. He came to her and stopped and looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who is seeing something he has been anticipating for a very long time and is discovering that anticipation does not adequately prepare you for the reality. Ashford, he said, Master Chief. He looked at the rifle in her hand. He had seen that rifle before. He had seen it in the hands of the man who owned it in a different country, in a different decade, in a room that smelled like bad coffee, in the particular weight of honest conversation. Burke's going to be okay, she said. I know, I got the report. He paused. 10 positions. 18 minutes. He nodded. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and he produced an envelope. It was sealed, the wax stamp pressed unevenly in the way of someone who is doing a careful thing quickly, and it had her name on it in handwriting. She recognized immediately, viscerally, with the part of her that lived below language, the handwriting of a man who had taught her to read terrain and hold her breath and understand the space between heartbeats. Her father's handwriting. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. He wrote it before his last deployment, Brennan said. His voice had lost its operational edge. It was just his voice now, the voice of a man in his late 50s who had seen everything and was still capable of being moved by some of it. He asked me to hold it until the right moment. How long have you had it? She said. 4 years. She looked up at him. I've been waiting, he said simply. She took the envelope. She did not open it. She held it with both hands, feeling the weight of it, not physical weight, the weight of the other kind, the kind that accumulates in sealed things when the person who sealed them is gone. She held it against her chest with one hand and the rifle with the other, and she stood in the valley where her father's rifle had just done what it was built to do, and she breathed. Brennan said nothing. He stood beside her and said nothing and gave her the space that the moment required. After a long time, she said, Did you know when you saw me here? Did you know what I could do? He considered the question with the care it deserved. I knew what your father built, he said. I knew that kind of thing doesn't disappear. I tried to make it disappear. I know you did. I promised my mother. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I know you did, and I know she meant it, and I know you meant it, and I know your father understood both of those things when he wrote that letter. He looked at the envelope in her hands. He wasn't asking you to break your promise, Kira. He was asking you to know why you made it and to know what to do when the world made it impossible to keep. She looked at the envelope. She put it in her vest pocket next to the assignment sheet that was still there, still folded, still a record of the day a man had humiliated her in a briefing room, and then buried the report that might have prevented everything that followed. She would read the letter later, when she was alone, when she could hold it the way it needed to be held. The medevac lifted at 07:52 with Burke and 2 other wounded aboard. Kira stood and watched it rise and tracked it with her eyes until it was a sound rather than a shape, and then she turned back to the valley and the work of what came next. At 0800, the QRF commander, a major named Hensley, who had the compact, efficient energy of someone who had been moving at operational tempo for so long, it had become his resting state, formally requested a debrief from all engaged personnel. The word formally was doing a lot of work in that request because what it meant in practice was that everyone in the valley was going to have to explain in sequence exactly what had happened, and their explanations were going to have to cohere into a single official account that could be transmitted to FOB Liberty and from there up the chain of command to places where people made decisions. Kira understood as she walked toward the debrief position that the decisions were going to be significant. She had been a communications specialist for 7 years. She had a specific role, specific clearances, specific operational parameters. She had just operated completely outside all of them. She had picked up a weapon. She was not assigned engaged enemy combatants in a sustained precision shooting action and performed at a level that was going to require explanation, no matter how clearly the circumstances justified it. She was not afraid of the explanation. She was not afraid of most things anymore. She had discovered that in the 18 minutes somewhere between the 5th and 6th target, that a certain kind of fear had simply evacuated. Not the productive fear that sharpens you, but the other kind, the fear of being seen, of being known of the world, understanding what you were capable of and deciding what to do with it. That fear had been with her for 7 years, and it was gone, and she was not sure yet whether to mourn it. Torres fell into step beside her on the way to the debrief position. "You know what's going to happen next," he said. "Not a question." "Command review," she said. "Official report. Someone up the chain is going to want answers." "And after that," she glanced at him. "I don't know." "I do," he said. He said it with the calm certainty of a man who has watched organizations react to unexpected capability often enough to know the pattern. "They're going to want to use what you just demonstrated. They're not going to be able to unknow it." She walked in silence for a moment. "That's their decision to make. You don't have an opinion about it." She thought about her mother's hands at the funeral. She thought about the letter in her pocket. She thought about Burke's pulse under her fingers, steady, real, alive, because she had made it so. "I have a lot of opinions about it," she said. "Most of them are complicated." Torres almost smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I imagine they are." The debrief began at 08:15 with Hensley running the room in the particular way of someone who knows the information he's gathering is above his pay grade and is determined to gather it accurately anyway. He went in convoy order: communications status, vehicle status, personnel status, engagement, sequence. When he reached Kira, he paused with his pen above his notepad in the way of a man who is aware that he is about to write something that is going to be read by many people above him. "Specialist Ashford," he said, "walk me through your actions from the moment you exited Vehicle 2. She walked him through it. She was precise and sequential, and she described what she had done in the same flat professional language she used for communications reports as distance, target position, engagement method, outcome. She did not editorialize. She did not justify. She stated facts. When she finished the debrief, position was very quiet. Hensley looked at his notepad. He looked at her. He said very carefully, "Specialist, what is your weapons qualification?" "Pistol," she said. "M9 expert rating." "And prior to today, when did you last fire a long-range precision rifle?" The pause was very short. 7 years ago. He wrote that down. His pen moved slowly like it was being careful. 7 years, he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at his notepad again. He was a man who dealt in concrete facts, and the concrete facts in front of him were producing an arithmetic that didn't work by any standard framework he had for understanding human performance. 10 targets, he said. 18 minutes. 7 years since your last qualification. "Yes, sir." He put his pen down. He looked at her directly. "Specialist, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to understand that your answer is going in this report exactly as you give it." "Understood." "Who taught you to shoot like that?" She met his gaze. "My father, Marcus Ashford." Hensley was still for a moment. Then something moved through his expression. Recognition, the particular recognition that comes from a name that means something in certain circles, that carries a weight of history and reputation even years after the man himself is gone. "Marcus Ashford," he said. "Yes, sir." He picked up his pen. He wrote the name down very carefully. "I see," he said quietly, and something in his voice said that he did. At 0900, the convoy began the return to FOB Liberty. Kira rode back in Vehicle 2 with Reyes, who did not talk this time. He drove with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who has decided that this particular road deserves his full respect. She sat with the rifle across her knees. Hensley had cleared her to maintain possession of it, pending further command review, and the letter in her vest pocket, and the particular exhaustion that arrives not from physical effort, but from the sustained expenditure of something that lives deeper than muscles. After 20 minutes of silence, Reyes said, "My dad was infantry, 2 tours Gulf War." He paused. He used to say the bravest thing he ever saw was someone doing the thing they were most afraid of doing. Kira looked out the window at the road. "I wasn't afraid," she said. Reyes thought about that. No, she was quiet for a moment. Not of the shooting, she paused, of what it meant, that I could still do it, that it was still there. Reyes drove in silence for a moment. "Why would that scare you?" She didn't answer. He didn't push. They drove back through the villages that had been empty on the way out. Some of them were no longer empty. Life had returned to them cautiously, the way life always returns to places after the sound of shooting has stopped testing the quiet, making sure it was real. She watched the villages pass and thought about her father's voice saying, "You were built for this," and her mother's voice saying, "Promise me," in the space between those two things that she had been living in for 7 years. She thought, "I kept the promise as long as I could." She thought, "I don't know if that's enough." She thought, "I don't know if it was supposed to be." At 10:15, FOB Liberty came into view. And through the gate, standing in the dust with his arms crossed and an expression that had settled into something she had never seen on his face before, something careful and serious and stripped of the particular casual authority he carried everywhere. Like a second uniform was Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Mitchell. He was looking directly at the convoy. He was looking, she understood, as Vehicle 2 pulled through the gate specifically at her. She met his gaze through the window. He held it. The vehicle stopped. She got out. And the base that had known her for 11 months as the quiet communications girl who answered phones, the base that had looked past her and through her and around her for every one of those 11 months, went very still when she stepped onto the ground with Marcus Ashford's rifle and the letter she hadn't opened yet and the wait of 18 minutes that had changed everything. People stopped. Not dramatically, not all at once, but one by one in the way that a crowd settles when it becomes aware that something real is happening. At its center, personnel slowed and turned and looked at her, and she walked through the looking without breaking stride. Mitchell said, "Ashford." "Sir?" "My office, 10 minutes." "Yes, sir." He turned and walked. She followed. Brennan was by the operations building. She passed close to him, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and that was its own kind of communication. The communication of two people who understand that what is about to happen in the next 10 minutes is beyond either of their ability to control and who have made their peace with that. At 10:22, she sat across from Mitchell in a room that smelled like coffee and paperwork and the accumulated decision weight of a command position. He had the sealed letter on his desk, a copy she realized Brennan had gotten him a copy before she had received the original, and he had clearly read it more than once. The edges were slightly worn from handling. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. He was the kind of man who used silence deliberately, and she recognized it and did not fill it. "Your father was Marcus Ashford," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "The ghost of Kandahar." He said the call sign carefully, like he understood it carried a specific gravity. 42 confirmed long-range kills. Highest single deployment sniper accuracy in the history of his unit. He paused. "And you are his daughter." "Yes, sir." "You trained under him?" "From the age of 6, she said, "until I was 17. He looked at the letter. "He describes it differently. He says he didn't train you. He says he showed you what you already were." She said nothing. "He says—" Mitchell stopped. He reread something on the page. His expression shifted slightly, the shift of a man encountering something that is not military in its language, and is therefore briefly outside his normal processing range. He cleared his throat and read aloud carefully, "She doesn't need to be made into anything. She already is. The only question is whether the world will give her room to be it honestly, or whether it will keep asking her to be something smaller." The room held those words for a moment. Kira felt them land somewhere below the professional composure, somewhere she had been protecting for 7 years. And she held very still because the alternative was not something she would permit herself in this room. "He wrote that letter knowing he wasn't coming back," Mitchell said. He lowered the page. "He wrote it for you, and he trusted Brennan to know when you needed it." "I know," she said. "Brennan knew who you were when you arrived," Mitchell said. "He said nothing to this command." "I asked him not to." She met his gaze. "When I arrived and realized he knew my father, I asked him to let me be just communications. Mitchell looked at her, and he honored that. He did, until he decided he couldn't anymore. He made the right call, Mitchell said quietly. Then after a pause, even if his timing was imperfect, she thought about Ethan Burke on the ground with a round in his shoulder. She thought about what different timing might have meant. She did not say any of that aloud because she was also thinking about the fact that she had refused to let Brennan say anything for 7 years, and that the weight of that choice was hers as much as his. Mitchell set the letter down and folded his hands on his desk. I need to ask you something directly, specialist, and I need a direct answer. Yes, sir. When you filed that terrain assessment 2 days ago and Kane didn't respond, did you consider escalating it? The pause was exactly 1 second. Yes, sir. Why didn't you? She had asked herself that question on every vehicle ride and every sleepless interval of the night before and every step of the valley floor between vehicle 2 and vehicle 3. She had several answers. None of them were simple. Because I had been invisible here for 11 months, she said. Because my role is communications. Because I had been careful for 7 years to never be more than what I was assigned to be. And because I was afraid that if I pushed harder, someone would start asking questions I wasn't prepared to answer. Mitchell held her gaze. Questions about your father. Questions about what I could do. What I had been built to do. She paused. If I escalated, someone would want to know why a communications specialist had the tactical vocabulary to produce that terrain assessment. And if they pulled that thread, the whole picture would have come out. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment. And so 3 people got hurt that didn't have to. She held that. She held it the way you hold something that is true and heavy and yours to carry. Yes, sir. Partly because of me. Partly because of Kane, he said. Yes, sir. Partly. He nodded once. He picked up a pen. He set it back down. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at a decision and is now determining the best way to communicate it. Effective immediately, he said, you are relieved of communications duties pending a full command review of your status and capabilities. He paused. That is not a punishment. It is a recognition that your current assignment does not reflect your actual capacity and that continuing it would be a disservice to this mission and to you personally. She said nothing. The review will take a minimum of 2 weeks. During that time, you will be restricted to base. You will be asked to cooperate fully with assessment personnel that I will be bringing in from outside this command. He looked at her steadily. People who knew your father, people who can evaluate what he built in you and determine how it should be officially classified and utilized. She felt the ground shift slightly under her, not physically the interior kind of shift, the kind that happens when the structure of a life you have built very carefully begins to change shape around you. And if I don't want to be classified and utilized, she said, he held her gaze for a long moment, then that will be your right to assert after the review. He paused. But Kieran, I'm speaking now outside of official record. I don't think you picked up that rifle today because you didn't want this. I think you picked it up because you did, because some part of you has always known what you are and it got tired of pretending. The room was very quiet. She thought about Burke alive on the ground. She thought about 10 positions going silent one by one. She thought about the weight of the rifle in her hands and the feeling of something opening up inside her that had been sealed shut for 7 years. She thought about her father's voice. You were built for this. She thought about her mother's hands. Promise me. Sir, she said, can I ask you something? Go ahead. The letter. What else did he say? Mitchell looked at the page. He was quiet for a moment and she understood that he was selecting that the letter contained more than he had read aloud and that he was deciding how much of the rest she needed to hear right now. He read, she is going to break the promise eventually, not because she is weak, because the world is going to ask something of her that only she can answer. When that happens, tell her this: a promise made out of love is not a chain. It is a starting point. What matters is what you build on the other side of it. Kira sat very still. She pressed her hand against the outside of her vest pocket, feeling the shape of the letter underneath the fabric. The letter she still hadn't opened. The letter that had been waiting 4 years for the right moment. Thank you, sir, she said. Dismissed, he said quietly. She stood. She picked up the rifle. She walked to the door. Ashford. She stopped. Your father was right, Mitchell said, about what you are. He paused. This command was lucky you were in that valley today. I don't intend for luck to be the operational plan going forward. She turned, she looked at him, she did not smile, but something in her expression acknowledged what he had said in a way that was more honest than a smile would have been, something that was tired and complicated and present and real. She walked out. The base was still moving around her. The operational tempo of FOB Liberty had not stopped for the events of the morning. It never stopped. It could not stop. The machine of the mission was always running. But she moved through it differently than she had moved through it for 11 months. She moved through it as herself, whatever that was going to mean now, whatever shape it was going to take on the other side of a 2-week review, and the decisions of people she had never met, who were going to read her father's letter and watch her shoot and try to put a category around something that resisted categorization. She found a quiet corner of the base outside the operations building where the wind came through from the north and the mountains were visible in the distance. She sat down. She took out the letter. She opened it. Her father's handwriting. His particular slant, the way he pressed harder on the letters that mattered, the way some words were larger than others because he felt them more, and it moved through his pen without him deciding it would. She read it twice. She sat with it for a long time after that, looking at the mountains, holding the pages against the wind. She did not cry. She had cried for Marcus Ashford already years ago, in the particular private way of someone who has allowed themselves exactly as much grief as they can hold, and then sealed the rest away. What she felt now was different. It was not grief, it was something closer to recognition, the feeling of being known completely and accurately by someone who was gone. He had seen her, all of her, the parts she showed and the parts she had spent 7 years bearing. He had seen what she would do and what it would cost her and what it would mean, and he had written it all down and trusted it to a man who would know when to give it to her. He had been right about everything. She folded the letter carefully. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in her pocket. She picked up the rifle and rested it across her knees and sat in the quiet of the base with the mountains in the distance and the wind on her face. She thought, Mama, I'm sorry. She thought, Papa, I understand. She sat there until the sun moved and the shadows changed, and someone eventually came to tell her that she was needed inside. And she got up and carried the rifle and the letter and the weight of what she was and walked back in. The 2 weeks that Mitchell had described as a minimum turned into 11 days. On the morning of the 12th day, 2 men arrived at FOB Liberty in a vehicle that carried no unit markings and wore uniforms that were technically correct and communicatively empty. The kind of correct that tells you nothing about who a person actually is or who they actually work for. They came through the gate at 700, checked in with the duty officer, and asked for Specialist Kira Ashford by name. The duty officer, a young sergeant named Patel who had been at FOB Liberty for 4 months and had heard the story of the valley approximately 40 times in 11 days, looked up from his desk and said, "Yes, sir," with the particular composure of someone who had been expecting something like this and was still not entirely prepared for it. Kira was in the range. She had been in the range every morning for 11 days from 0600 to 0900, running the assessment protocol that Brennan and Mitchell had designed together in the 3 days following the valley. It was not an official protocol. Official would come later with the outside evaluators, with the paperwork and the command decisions. This was something more personal than official. It was Brennan standing at the far end of a firing range at FOB Liberty, watching a woman he had been quietly watching for 11 months finally stop pretending. She was not pretending anymore. The range had shown them both things. Some of them were expected. Her accuracy at distance was extraordinary, consistent across weather conditions and positions, the product of training so deeply embedded, it operated below the level of conscious technique. She did not aim the way taught marksmen aim. She aimed the way people aim who learned to shoot before they learned to think about shooting, which is to say the process was invisible from the outside because it had been internalized past the point of observation. Some of what the range showed them was unexpected. On the 4th day, Brennan had set up a scenario he called a distraction protocol, ambient noise radio chatter, deliberate interruptions between shots intended to break concentration and force reset. He had used it on every sniper trainee he had ever evaluated. Most of them degraded by 12 to 18% under the protocol. the best he had ever seen degraded by 6. Kira's accuracy under the distraction protocol was within 1% of her baseline. He had stood at the far end of the range after she fired the last shot of the sequence and looked at his clipboard for a long time without writing anything. She had walked up beside him. Problem. No, he said. He paused. Your father used to tell me that real precision isn't about concentration. He said concentration was what beginners used. He said the goal was to get past concentration entirely to a place where everything external became irrelevant because the process was operating at a level that external things couldn't reach. She had looked at the target downrange. He used to say that to me too. Did you believe him? She had been quiet for a moment. I didn't understand it until today. Brennan had written the number down then. He had written it down and stared at it and thought about Marcus Ashford with his bad coffee and his particular stillness, and the words she was built for this. On the 7th day, the base had a visitor. Colonel Dana Reeves arrived from Bagram in a command helicopter, with the efficiency of someone for whom helicopters were simply how you got places. She was 53 years old, had commanded units in 3 combat theaters, and had a particular reputation within the special operations community for identifying non-standard capability and figuring out what to do with it. She had been a friend of Marcus Ashford's in the way that serious people in serious professions form friendships built on mutual respect and the shared understanding of what the work actually cost. She had read Mitchell's report on the way from Bagram. She had read it twice. She found Kira in the operations building that evening, sitting at a table with a topographical map she had requisitioned from the planning section, making annotations in the margins, with a pencil in the quiet, absorbed way of someone following a thought to its end. She was not annotating communications coordinates. She was annotating elevation relationships and field of fire geometry, which was not what communications specialists did with topographical maps. Reeves sat down across from her without being invited. Kira looked up. Colonel, she said. At ease, Reeves said, though Kira hadn't been at attention. It was the kind of thing you say to establish a register. I'm Dana Reeves. I knew your father. Something shifted in Kira's expression, not dramatically, but present. Real. He mentioned you, she said. He called you the straightest shooter he'd ever met, and he specified he didn't mean with a rifle. Reeves almost smiled. That sounds like him. She looked at the map. She looked at the annotations. She looked at Kira. Mitchell's report is thorough. Brennan's assessment notes are even more thorough. I've spent the last 3 hours reading both. And, Kira said, and I have questions, Reeves has said, not about what you did in the valley. That's documented well enough that I don't need elaboration. She paused. I want to understand why you buried it. Kira looked at the map for a moment. Then she looked at Reeves. My mother asked me to. I know that. I read the letter. Reeves held her gaze. I want to understand why that was enough. It was a harder question than it sounded. Kira recognized it as such, the kind of question that has a simple answer and a real one, and that the simple answer will satisfy some people and the real one will satisfy others. And you have to decide very quickly which kind of person you're talking to. She decided, because I was 17 years old when they brought that flag to our door, she said. And I looked at my mother's face when she received it, and I understood for the first time that being good at something is not the same as being safe, that the thing my father was best at in the world was also the thing that took him away from us. She paused. She didn't ask me to be ordinary. She asked me not to be consumed. She asked me to come home. Reeves was quiet for a moment. And you thought that if you used the skill, you couldn't come home. I thought if I became what he built me to be, I would end up where he ended up, and she would be alone. Is she still alive, your mother? Yes. Reeves nodded slowly. Marcus understood that, she said. He told me once, the year before he died, that the hardest thing about what he'd built in you was that he couldn't promise you it would be survivable. He said the skill was real, but so was the cost. She paused. He also said that the people who came home were the ones who knew what they were fighting for at the same level they knew how to fight. Kira said nothing. Do you know what you're fighting for? Reeves said. The question sat in the room between them. I'm still working that out, Kira said. Reeves nodded. Good answer, she said. The ones who answer that question too fast are the ones I worry about. She stood. She looked at the map annotations for another moment. Get some sleep, specialist. We have a full evaluation beginning at 0600 tomorrow. I want to see everything." She walked out. Kira sat with the map for a long time after that, looking at the annotations she had made, thinking about what she was fighting for and whether the answer she was still working out was going to be enough. At 05:53 the following morning, 11 minutes before the official evaluation was scheduled to begin, Garrett Kane came to the range. She was already there. She was always already there. He came in through the side entrance and stood back and watched her run a dry fire sequence. The rifle unloaded the motion, practiced in the pure form of muscle memory exercise, each part of the process executed without the variable of the shot itself, so that the body could find and refine the mechanics without noise. He watched for 3 minutes before she acknowledged him. She didn't turn around. "Kane," he stopped. "You knew I was there. 30 seconds after you came in." He was quiet for a moment. "You do that everywhere. Read positions." "Yes." He came closer. He stood beside her, not behind her, which she registered as a deliberate choice. He looked at the rifle. "Can I ask you something? You're going to either way." Something moved in his expression that might have been the beginning of a real conversation. "The terrain report," he said. "When I buried it, were you angry?" She considered that. No. I was resigned," she said. She set the rifle down and turned to face him. "I had spent 11 months being exactly what everyone expected me to be. And I had filed a report that required someone to take a communications specialist seriously on a tactical assessment, which was not something this base had any prior reason to do, because I had given them no prior reason." She paused. "I was resigned because I understood why it happened, even when it shouldn't have." He held her gaze. "That's more charitable than I deserve." "It's not charitable," she said. "It's accurate. You made a bad call based on bad assumptions. Those bad assumptions existed partly because of choices I made." She picked up the rifle again. "That doesn't make it right. It makes it complicated." He was quiet for a moment. "Burke's being transferred to Bagram for surgery. He's going to recover full function." "I know. I got the update this morning." "He asked about you, specifically." She turned back to the range without answering. "He said to tell you." Kane paused. He said it like a man delivering a message that he is aware is not for him, but is moved by regardless. "He said to tell you that your father would be proud." She was still for exactly 2 seconds. Then she raised the rifle and resumed the dry fire sequence and did not respond, and Kane understood that the absence of a response was not dismissal. It was the opposite. He left her to it. The formal evaluation ran from 0600 to 1700 that day, with Reeves running the protocol and Brennan observing, and 2 additional evaluators from Special Operations Command who had arrived with Reeves and who communicated primarily through clipped professional language and the particular intensity of people doing a job they take extremely seriously. They put her through everything. Long-range precision shooting at distances up to 800 meters, which was 200 meters beyond the engagement distances of the valley. Moving targets, partially obscured targets, low-light simulation, wind variable scenarios. Consecutive shot sequences with mandatory position changes between each one. Terrain reading exercises where they showed her maps and photographs and asked her to identify optimal engagement positions, optimal escape routes, optimal observation points, the logic of cover and concealment, and the geometry of fields of fire. She answered the shooting with the rifle. She answered the terrain questions with a pencil in the flat professional language of someone who has been answering questions precisely for 11 months and is now applying that precision to subject matter she actually knows. By 1400, the 2 evaluators from Special Operations Command had stopped writing and started watching. That was the sign that Brennan had been looking for. He had seen it before in other evaluations, other candidates. The shift from documentation to witness. At 1700, Reeves called the evaluation complete. She told Kira she was dismissed for the evening. Kira left. Reeves, Brennan, Mitchell, and the 2 evaluators stood in the range for 40 minutes after that, in a conversation that Kira was not party to, and that nobody summarized for her directly, but whose shape she could read from the decisions that came out of it. At 19:30, Mitchell came to her quarters. He knocked. She opened the door. He looked like a man who has arrived at a significant moment and is being appropriately deliberate about it. "May I come in?" "Yes, sir." He came in. He stood rather than sat, which told her something about the register of what he was about to say. He looked at her directly the way he had looked at her across his desk on the day she came back from the valley. Colonel Reeves has completed her evaluation, he said. Her assessment combined with Brennan's notes and my own command observations is being transmitted to Special Operations Command tonight. He paused. The formal recommendation is that your status be reclassified effective upon command approval from communications specialist to Special Operations Sniper candidate with immediate entry into an accelerated qualification program specifically designed for on. He paused again. The pause was not hesitation. It was the kind of pause that comes before a word that carries weight for individuals of demonstrated exceptional capability. She stood very still. There are 3 such programs in the current SOC structure, he continued. 2 blue are standard pipeline entries. The third is a program that has had 6 candidates in its history. He looked at her steadily. Your father was one of them. The room held that for a moment. What happened to the other 5, she said. 4 completed the program, went on to distinguish themselves in ways that are classified at levels above this command. He paused. 1 didn't complete it. What happened to that one? She decided the cost was too high, Mitchell said simply. She requested return to her original MOS and was honorably transferred. She's a high school history teacher in Oregon now. He held her gaze. The program doesn't compel, it offers. She looked at the floor for a moment, then at him. And the offer is contingent on what? Your voluntary acceptance in writing, with full understanding that you can withdraw at any stage. He paused. And one other thing. She waited. Colonel Reeves wants to speak with your mother before you sign anything, he said. She said, and I'm quoting her directly, that your mother has a stake in this decision, that this command is not willing to override unilaterally. Something broke open in Kira's chest quietly, and without drama, the way things break open when kindness arrives in a form you are not expecting. She had not anticipated that. She had been preparing herself for the military logic of the situation, the capability assessment, the program recommendation, the paperwork. She had not been prepared for someone to think about her mother. She pressed her lips together for a moment. She stopped, started again. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Thank Reeves. It was her call. He turned to leave. Then he stopped. One more thing, he said without turning back around. Garrett Kane filed a supplementary report this morning, unprompted, about the terrain assessment you submitted 2 days before the mission. He paused. He took full responsibility for the failure to action it. He specified that the failure was his, that the assessment was accurate, and that the outcome of the mission was directly shaped by his decision to disregard it. Kira said nothing. He didn't have to do that, Mitchell said. I know. It's in his permanent record now, alongside everything else. He walked out. She stood in her quarters for a long moment after the door closed. She thought about Kane in the briefing room, laughing, dropping the assignment sheet. She thought about Kane in the valley pressed against the wheel well of Vehicle 4, watching the rifle barrel move. She thought about Kane at the range that morning, delivering Burke's message with the careful sincerity of a man who was trying to become more honest than he had been. She thought people are more complicated than the worst thing they do. She thought that doesn't make the worst thing they do acceptable. She thought both of those things can be true at the same time. At 2100, she called her mother. The signal from FOB Liberty to a cell phone in Savannah, Georgia was not perfect. It never was. There was always a slight delay, a faint compression of sound that made voices travel through the line slightly different than they were in person. But her mother's voice, even compressed and delayed, was immediately and completely itself the voice of a woman in her early 60s who had spent decades being the kind of steady that she had raised her daughter to be. Kira, baby. Just that, just her name the way her mother had always said it, 2 syllables that contained everything. Hi, Mama. You sound different. Her mother had the particular instinct of a woman who had spent decades listening carefully to a soldier, husband, and then a soldier daughter. She could read voices the way Kira read terrain. What happened? Kira had thought on the way to making the call about how to begin. She had several versions of the beginning. She discarded all of them when she heard her mother's voice and settled on the only version that was actually available to her, which was the true one. I picked up a rifle, she said. Silence on the line. I broke my promise, she said. I want to explain why. I need you to hear me, and I need you to know that I'm sorry, And then I need to tell you something that a woman named Colonel Dana Reeves is going to call you about in the next few days, and I want you to hear it from me first." More silence. And then her mother's voice doing something Kira had not heard it do in a very long time. Something that was cracking slightly at the edges, not from weakness, but from the particular emotion of a woman who has been holding something for a long time and is now carefully putting some of it down. "Were you safe?" her mother said. "Yes, Mama." "Were other people safe because of what you did?" She thought about Burke's pulse under her fingers. She thought about 10 positions going silent. She thought about Reyes and Torres and Holloway and the 22 people in that convoy who had driven into a constructed execution and driven back out because the geometry of the situation had changed. "Yes," she said. Her mother was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said very softly, "Your daddy used to say something. I never told you because I didn't think you needed to hear it. I thought it would pull you toward the thing I was trying to keep you from." She paused. "He used to say that the difference between a weapon and a guardian was the thing you were willing to protect." Kira closed her eyes. "What were you protecting?" her mother said. "People," Kira said. "People who would have died if I didn't." Another long silence. "Okay, huh?" her mother said finally. The word was simple and complete the way her mother's important words always were. "Okay. Are you angry?" "I'm scared," her mother said. "That's different from angry." She paused. "I've been scared since the day I found out you enlisted. I made my peace with scared a long time ago." Another pause. "Tell me about this colonel who wants to call me," Kira told her. She told her everything in the sequential, honest way of someone who has decided that partial truths are no longer available to her. She told her about the valley and the rifle, and the 18 minutes, and the letter, and the evaluation and the program, and the choice that was being offered to her. She told her what her father had written. She quoted the part she had memorized, which was most of it, because she had read it enough times that it lived in her now. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was how she had always listened to the things that mattered. When Kira finished, her mother said, "He knew about all of it. He always knew." "Yes." "He wrote you a letter because he trusted you to get here." "Yes." "He wasn't trying to push you," her mother said slowly, working through it as she spoke the way she worked through things she was feeling in real time. "He was trying to be there for you when you arrived." "Yes," Kira said. Her voice was steady. She was working to keep it that way. "That's what it felt like when I read it." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Kira." "Yes, Mama. I'm going to talk to this colonel woman, and I'm going to say hard things to her because that is my right as your mother, and I intend to exercise it completely." Kira almost smiled. "I know. And then I'm going to listen to what she says. And then I am going to support whatever you decide, because you are 32 years old and you have earned the right to decide what your life is going to be." Her voice tightened slightly. "But I need you to promise me one thing." "Anything." "Come home," her mother said. "Whatever you decide, whatever they ask you to do, you come home." "I promise," Kira said. She meant it the way she had meant the first promise completely. But she understood saying it this time what her father had meant in the letter. A promise made out of love is a starting point. What matters is what you build on the other side of it. She was going to build something on the other side of this one. She didn't know yet exactly what it looked like. She didn't know yet what the program would ask of her, or whether she would be the same person on the far end of it that she was on this end. She didn't know what the military would ultimately decide to do with the thing her father had built in her, or whether what they decided would be something she could accept. But she knew she was going to find out. She said goodnight to her mother. She put the phone down. She sat in the quiet of her quarters and thought about everything and about nothing, and let the day's weight move through her in the way that things need to move through you when they are too large to hold still. At 22:47, someone knocked on her door. She opened it. Brennan stood in the corridor. He was in his off-duty clothes, which made him look like a slightly different version of himself, less operational, more human, the version of Donovan Brennan that existed outside of the 41 deployments and the sealed letters and the 11 months of watching a woman pretend to be smaller than she was. He held out a mug of coffee. "It's bad," he said. She took it. She stepped back to let him in. He came in and leaned against the wall and held his own mug with both hands. "You talked to your mother," he said. It was not a question. Yes. How is she scared, honest, herself? Kira looked at the coffee. She said my father used to say that the difference between a weapon and a guardian was the thing you were willing to protect. Brennan was quiet for a moment. He said that to me too, in slightly different words. He paused. He was talking about you when he said it. She looked up. He said it the day you were born, Brennan said. We were in the field. He got the news over a satellite phone. He didn't say anything for about 20 minutes, and then he said, I just became the thing I would protect with everything I have. There's no going back from that. He paused. I think that was the beginning of the letter in a way. He spent 30 years trying to figure out how to give that to you. Kira held the mug and felt the warmth of it against her palms and sat with what Brennan had just given her. Not new information exactly, but information that connected things she had held separately into something complete. He did give it to me, she said. He did, Brennan said. They drank bad coffee in silence for a while. The base moved around them, the generators, the perimeter, the distant radio chatter that never fully stopped. The infrastructure of a place that was always on some level braced for something. After a while, Brennan said, what are you going to do? She thought about their program. She thought about the other 5 candidates, the 4 who came out the far end, and the one who went to Oregon and taught history. She thought about Burke's message from Bagram, and her mother's voice on the phone, and her father's handwriting pressing harder on the words that mattered. She thought about 10 positions going silent, and the valley going quiet, and the particular feeling in the moment after the last shot of having been completely and entirely herself for the first time in 7 years. I'm going to find out what I was built for, she said. Brennan looked at her over his mug. In his expression was something she had not seen there before. Not the cautious, watchful assessment of a man waiting for the right moment. Something beyond that. Something that had been waiting behind the assessment for 11 months and was now allowed to surface. Pride. Clean and uncomplicated and real. Your father would say, you already know, he said. Yeah, she said. I think he'd be right. The paperwork arrived on a Tuesday. Kira knew it was coming. Reeves had told her it would come within 72 hours of the command approval. And the command approval had come through on Saturday evening quietly without ceremony, the way the most significant decisions in military bureaucracy always arrived as a single document in a standard folder placed on a standard desk by a person who treated it like any other piece of paper, because treating it like any other piece of paper was how the system maintained its composure in the face of things that were not ordinary at all. Mitchell called her to his office at 9 o'clock. She came in and sat across from him, and he slid the folder across the desk without preamble, which was his way of respecting her by not cushioning it. She opened it. The reclassification document was 3 pages. The program acceptance form was 2. The acknowledgement of voluntary participation was 1. She read every word of all 6 pages, which took her 9 minutes, and Mitchell waited without checking his watch or his phone or doing anything other than sitting across from her with his hands folded and his expression calibrated to the particular patience of a man who understands that some things require 9 minutes. When she finished, she looked up. This is real, she said, not a question. The kind of statement you make when something has moved from abstract to concrete and you need to say it out loud to complete the transition. It's real, he said. She looked back at the last page, the signature line, her name printed beneath it in the clean sans serif font of official documents everywhere. She thought about her father's handwriting, the way he pressed harder on the words that mattered. She thought about her mother on the phone saying, come home. She signed. Mitchell took the folder back without looking at the signature. He had already seen what he needed to see. Reeves is waiting for you at the range, he said. She wants to start the preliminary program assessment today. Today, Kira said. She said, and I'm quoting again because Reeves is worth quoting, the longer we wait, the more time the system has to complicate something that is actually very simple. Kira stood. What's simple about it? Mitchell almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to it. She said you're the best natural precision shooter she's evaluated in 22 years of special operations work. She said complicating that with bureaucratic delay would be the kind of stupidity that gives institutions a bad name. He paused. She didn't use the word stupidity. She used a different word. Kira picked up her jacket. I can imagine which one. She walked to the range. Reeves was already there, which Kira had expected, and Torres was there too, which she had not. He was standing off to the side with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who has been invited to observe something and is taking the invitation seriously. He nodded when he saw her. She nodded back. Torres is going to be part of your integration team, Reeves said without greeting the way Reeves did most things directly from the relevant point with no detour through social convention. If the program takes you where I think it's going to take you, you'll be operating in proximity to SEAL elements. He volunteered. Kira looked at Torres. You volunteered. Someone who shoots the way you shoot needs a spotter who can keep up, he said. I figure I'm qualified. She turned back to the range. What are we doing today? Pressure assessment, Reeves said. I want to see how you perform when the stakes are real rather than simulated, which means we're not using paper targets. Kira waited. We're going outside the wire, Reeves said. There's a suspected weapons cache 12 kilometers northeast. Intelligence is 48 hours old, which means it's either still active or it's a dry run. Either way, command wants eyes on it. You and Torres forward observation precision, overwatch if required. She paused. It's a real mission, Ashford, not an exercise. I need you to understand that before you put that rifle in your hands today. Kira looked at the rifle on the rack. Her father's rifle, which had been cleaned and returned to her after the valley, and which now occupied a particular space in her operational life that was different from any object she had ever owned. It was not a memento. It was not a symbol. It was a tool that had been built for a specific purpose and had been used for that purpose and was now waiting to be used again. I understand, she said. Good, Reeves said. Wheels up in 40 minutes. The helicopter inserted them 4 kilometers from the cache location at 11:15. The insertion was clean and the terrain between the landing zone and the observation position was the kind of terrain that Kira processed automatically now, without deliberation, elevation cover, angle movement pattern. Torres moved well beside her. He had the particular quality of an experienced field operator who understood that moving quietly and moving efficiently were the same thing, and he matched her pace and her instincts without discussion. They reached the observation position at 12:03. She settled into it the way she settled into every position now. Not like someone taking a stance, but like someone arriving at a place they recognized. Torres set up the spotting scope beside her and began his own assessment, and for a while they worked in the complementary silence of two people doing related things at the same level of focus. Cache is active, Torres said quietly 11 minutes in. I count 3 individuals, southeast corner of the structure. 2 are armed. I see them, she said. 3rd one is moving. He's carrying something. She tracked. Container. Could be ordnance. Could be supplies. Reeves is going to want to call. She keyed her radio. Control, this is Ashford at observation position. I have eyes on 3 individuals, 2 armed, 1 transporting unknown container. Cache appears active, awaiting your direction. Reeves's voice came back immediately. Copy that, Ashford. Hold observation. QRF is 20 minutes out. Your job is eyes, not engagement, unless the situation changes. Copy, Kira said. She settled back into the scope and watched and did not move. Beside her, Torres was doing the same. The sun moved, the wind shifted 2 degrees, and she noted it and adjusted her hold without thinking about adjusting. The 3 individuals below moved in the pattern of people who believed themselves unobserved, which was the most useful kind of pattern to observe. At 12:51, the situation changed. A 4th individual appeared from inside the structure. He was not carrying a container. He was carrying a radio, and he was moving with the specific urgency of someone who has received information they need to act on immediately. They know something, Torres said quietly. They know something, she confirmed. Reeves. She keyed the radio. Control to have a 4th individual radio moving with purpose. I believe our position may be compromised or they've received external warning. QRF timeline. 14 minutes, Reeves said. Can you hold? She looked at the 4 individuals below. She calculated. She watched the 4th individual gesture to the 2 armed ones who began moving toward the structure's entrance with the coordinated movement of people executing a rehearsed plan. They're going to move the cache, she said on the radio. If they get it inside, we lose it. A pause, 2 seconds. The kind of pause that happens in command positions when a decision is being made very fast about something that cannot be unmade. Ashford, Reeves said. Your call. You have authorization if necessary. Say again your call. The radio went quiet. Torres looked at her, not with instruction, not with pressure, with the clear-eyed attention of a professional who has accepted that this particular decision belongs to the person beside him. She watched the two armed individuals reach the entrance. She watched the one with the container begin moving toward them. She breathed. She thought about what she was protecting. She fired twice. The two armed individuals went down. The one with the container stopped. The one with the radio ran. She tracked him for 4 seconds and then he was running away from the cache, away from the populated structure, and the QRF would have him within the 14-minute window. Control, she said. Two armed individuals neutralized. One runner moving northeast unarmed. Cache holder is stationary and complying. QRF can take the remaining two on arrival. Silence on the radio. Then Reeves's voice, and in it was something that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but lived in the specific territory between the two, the territory that belongs to people who have made a prediction and are watching it confirmed in real time. Copy that, Ashford. Outstanding. Torres lowered his spotting scope. He looked at her. She was already clearing her position, preparing for the QRF arrival, moving through the post-engagement protocol with the methodical attention of someone who is not thinking about what she just did, but about what needs to happen next, which was exactly the right orientation and exactly what her father had spent 11 years teaching her. Ashford, Torres said. I know, she said. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say that I made the right call. He was quiet for a moment. I was going to say that you've been making the right calls since before anyone gave you permission to. She kept moving through the protocol. I know that too. The QRF arrived at 13:08. The cache was secured. The runner was apprehended 2 kilometers northeast. The individual with the container was detained without further incident. The intelligence value of the cache turned out to be significant, not just weapons, but communications equipment and documents that the analyst would spend the next 72 hours processing. None of that was Kira's concern on the helicopter ride back. Her concern on the helicopter ride back was the particular internal accounting that happens after every engagement, the one that her father had taught her to run, not because it was required, but because it was necessary. A clear-eyed assessment of what you did, why you did it, whether it was right and what it cost. She ran the accounting. She came out the other side of it and knew that the calls had been correct and that the cost was real, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and that learning to hold both at once was the actual work of being what she was becoming. Torres sat across from her on the helicopter and watched her think and said nothing, which she was grateful for. Reeves was waiting at FOB Liberty when they landed. She was standing outside the operations building with her arms crossed and an expression that Kira was beginning to learn the expression of a woman who has already processed the operation and moved on to the next thing and is waiting for everyone else to catch up. Good work, Reeves said. One sentence. Reeves did not inflate. Thank you, ma'am. Mitchell wants a full debrief at 1600. After that, I need an hour with you alone. She paused. There are some things about the program I want to discuss before you go any further in. Things that weren't in the paperwork. Things that are never in the paperwork, Reeves said. She started toward the operations building and then stopped. Your mother called me this morning. Kira went still. Reeves turned. She called the number I gave her and she spoke to me for 40 minutes. She asked hard questions. I answered them honestly. Some of the answers were not easy. She held Kira's gaze. She wanted me to tell you something. What? She said your daddy spent his whole career protecting people he'd never meet. She said she used to be angry about that. She said she isn't anymore. Reeves paused. She said she raised you right and she trusts you to know the difference between a gun and a purpose. Kira stood in the dust of FOB Liberty and held that for a moment. She also said, Reeves continued with a slight change in her voice that might have been something close to warmth, that if this program gets her daughter killed, she will hold me personally responsible, and she does not consider rank a relevant factor. Something broke loose in Kira's chest and came out as a sound that was halfway between a breath and a laugh, real and unguarded and brief. The most unguarded she had been in front of a senior officer in 11 months. That's my mother, she said. I know, Reeves said. I liked her immediately. The 1,600 debrief was attended by Mitchell Reeves, Torres Brennan, and two analysts from the intelligence section who were there for the cash documentation. It ran for 90 minutes and covered every element of the operation in the precise sequential language of official record. Kira answered every question directly. She did not qualify, she did not hedge, she did not apologize for the decisions she had made in the field. She stated what she had done and why and what the outcomes were. When the analyst left the room, change register, Mitchell looked around the remaining group, Reeves, Brennan, Torres, Kira, and said, I want to address something before we close this out. Something that isn't in any official record and will not be. Everyone waited. Garrett Kane submitted a formal request this morning to be transferred out of FOB Liberty, he said. He cited personal performance concerns and requested reassignment to a stateside training role. He stated in the request that his judgment failures in the period preceding the Valley ambush represented a pattern of command thinking he needed to correct before he was fit to hold a leadership position in the field. The room was quiet. I approve the request, Mitchell said. He leaves Friday. Kira looked at the table. She thought about Kane in the briefing room. She thought about Kane at the range delivering Burke's message. She thought about what Reeves had said about people who answered the question of what they were fighting for too quickly being the ones she worried about. Kane, it turned out, had answered a different question, what he had failed at, and what he owed with more honesty than she had expected. Good, Torres said quietly. Nobody disagreed. After the room cleared, Brennan stayed behind. He waited until it was just him and Kira, which she understood was intentional, and then he sat down across from her at the table in the way of a man who has one more thing and knows it and has been deciding how to say it. I talked to Burke, he said, this morning. He's out of surgery. Full recovery expected. I know, Mitchell told me. He wants to come back, Brennan said, when he's cleared. He put in the request from the hospital bed. She looked at him. Back here. Back to any unit that has you in it. Brennan held her gaze. He said, and I am going to quote him because it deserves to be quoted exactly, I'm not letting the best sniper I've ever seen work without a qualified spotter who knows what he's looking at. Torres is good, but Burke is better, and Burke knows it. Something genuine and warm moved through her expression. He would say that. He also said, Brennan paused. He was doing the thing he did when what he had to say mattered most, which was take one breath before he said it. He said that your father used to talk about you, in the field sometimes. Not often, but when it mattered. He said Marcus would mention in passing that he had a daughter who understood what he did better than anyone he'd ever met, and that the hardest thing in his life was knowing she had chosen not to do it, and that he respected her for it completely. Kira was very still. He said it like it was a fact, Brennan said, not like it was grief, like it was something he had made his peace with and was proud of regardless. He paused. He was proud of you for stopping Kira. He said that out loud. Another pause. He was also proud of you for knowing when to start again. He just didn't get to say that part in person. She pressed her hand flat on the table. She looked at it. She looked at the scar on her right index finger from a training exercise at 16 that her father had wrapped himself, not saying a word, just wrapping it with the specific care of a man who understood that injuries were part of the cost, and that the cost did not make the work wrong. He had kissed the top of her head when he was done and gone back to the range, and she had followed him, and they had not discussed it again. He's saying it now, she said. Brennan looked at her. Yes, he said simply. He is. The sun was going down over the mountains when Kira walked to the range alone. She had 40 minutes before the debrief with Reeves, and she had needed to move, needed to be in a space that was hers, that was honest, that required nothing from her except presence. The range was empty at this hour. The light was low and long and orange in the way of Afghan evenings. The quality of light that her father had always said was the best light for thinking because it made everything look more like what it actually was. She sat on the bench at the far end of the range with the rifle across her knees and the letter in her vest pocket and the program forms back in Mitchell's office with her signature on them, and she thought about all of it without trying to resolve it into something simple because it was not simple, and she had decided to stop pretending it was. She thought about 11 months of invisibility and what it had cost her. She thought about the Valley and what 18 minutes had cost her and given her. She thought about a program that had 6 candidates in its history and her father's name in that number, in a signature line with her name printed beneath it in clean official font. She thought about her mother saying, "Come home," and meaning it as a direction rather than a restriction, meaning it as a North Star rather than a wall. She thought about Burke alive. She thought about 10 positions going silent. She thought about what she was willing to protect. At 17:48 exactly, Garrett Kane came to the range. She heard him before she saw him, his footsteps which were different from what they had been in the briefing room, different from what they had been on the day he dropped the assignment sheet, and laughed. Slower, more deliberate. The footsteps of a man who has decided to be careful about how he moves through the world for a while. He came around the end of the range and stopped when he saw her, and she did not turn around. "I heard you signed the paperwork," he said. "I did." "Good." He paused. "I'm leaving Friday." "I know." Another pause. He was working towards something, and she let him work the way she let most things work themselves out when they needed to without filling the space. "I want you to know something," he said, "before I go." She waited. "The day I made that assignment," he said, "the day I put you at the forward relay position, I told myself it was tactical, that it was about filling a slot." He paused. "It wasn't. I put you there because you were easy to put there, because you were quiet and you didn't push back, and I had already decided you didn't matter enough to push back." His voice was even. He had clearly rehearsed this not to make it smoother, but to make it honest, to remove the self-protection from it. "That's the truth of it, and 3 people paid for my truth." She was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I'm going to go somewhere and try to become someone who doesn't do that," he said. "And I think the starting point for that is saying the true version of it out loud to the person it most directly affected." She turned and looked at him. He met her gaze without flinching. Whatever else Garrett Kane was and had been, he was not a man who flinched from things, and she had never stopped being willing to give him that. "I hear you," she said. He nodded. "You should also know," she said, "that I buried my own capability for 7 years because I was afraid of what would happen if people like you saw it." She held his gaze. "That's my truth, and I think it's worth saying out loud too." Something moved through his expression that was not absolution and was not comfort, but was real, the specific look of a man receiving honest information and not deflecting it. "Yeah," he said, "I think it is." He walked out. She turned back to the range. She picked up the rifle. She held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, the physical weight, and the other weight, the weight of everything it was and everything it carried, and everything it had cost and everything it had saved. She thought, "I am Marcus Ashford's daughter." She thought, "I am my mother's daughter." She thought, "I am both of those things completely, and neither of them cancels the other out." She thought, "I spent 7 years trying to be only one of them, and I was wrong. Not because I was wrong to honor my mother's pain, but because she never actually asked me to stop being my father's daughter. She asked me to survive. She asked me to come home. And I translated that out of my own fear into something smaller than what she meant." The program was going to be hard. She knew that the way she knew terrain, not by hope, but by assessment. She had read enough between the lines of what Reeves had said and hadn't said to understand that the 6 candidates before her had earned their places through a cost that was not described in paperwork. She was going to earn hers through the same kind of cost. She was not afraid of the cost. She was, for the first time in 7 years, exactly as afraid as the situation warranted the productive fear, the kind that sharpens everything, the kind her father had told her to learn to distinguish from the other kind. At 1800, she heard footsteps again. Reeves. She came in and sat on the bench beside Kira and looked at the range for a moment before she spoke. "Ready," she said. "Yes," Kira said. "I want to tell you something before we begin," Reeves said. "Something that's not in any program document or command briefing." Kira waited. "Your father completed his program on a Tuesday," Reeves had said. "I know because I was there. I was a lieutenant attached to the evaluation team, and I was 29 years old, and I had already seen things that I thought had shown me the full range of what a human being was capable of." She paused. "And then I watched Marcus Ashford on a range, and I understood that I had not seen the full range, that there was a level of precision and instinct and controlled capability that existed above what I had categorized as the ceiling." She looked at Kira. "And then I read your father's letter, and I read Mitchell's report, and I came to this base, and I watched you on that range for 11 hours. She paused, "and I understood for the second time in my career that I had not yet seen the ceiling." Kira held very still. There's no program for what you are, Reeves said. There's a program that will give you structure and cover and the official language the military needs to utilize what you can do. But what you actually are, that was not made by a program. She looked at the rifle in Kira's hands. It was made by a man who understood what he had in his daughter and spent 17 years making sure she had every tool she would ever need. She paused. And then it was made by you, by 7 years of carrying it and still carrying it and not letting it die even when you were trying to. The range was very quiet. He called himself the Ghost of Kandahar, Reeves has said. His unit gave him that name because he was invisible until he wasn't, and by the time anyone knew he was there, it was already over. She stood. They're going to need a new name, she said. For you. She walked toward the door. Reeves, Kira said. Reeves stopped. Thank you, Kira said, for calling my mother back, for listening to her. Reeves turned. She's the reason you're here, she said simply. The promise you made her didn't hold you back. It held you together until you were ready. She paused. That woman knew exactly what she was doing. She walked out. So, Kira sat alone with the rifle in the mountains in the evening light going orange and long over everything. She thought about Tuesday mornings. She thought about her father completing his program on a Tuesday and what he had felt walking off that range, whether he had felt this specific compound of exhaustion and arrival and the quiet, certain knowledge of what comes next. She thought he probably had. She thought he would have wanted her to know that the knowledge didn't make the next thing easier. It just made it possible. She raised the rifle. She looked through the scope at the far end of the range. She breathed in. She breathed out. She found the stillness that lived below concentration, the place her father had described, and that she had not understood until a distraction protocol on the 4th day of an assessment showed her that it had been living in her all along. She held the stillness. She pulled the trigger on an empty chamber and felt the clean mechanical click of a rifle operating exactly as it was designed to the sound of a thing built for a purpose doing that purpose, without apology or hesitation or ambiguity. She lowered the rifle. She stood up. Kira Ashford, Specialist Communications, quiet, invisible. The girl nobody noticed walked off the range at FOB Liberty on a Tuesday evening with her father's rifle in her hands, her mother's voice in her chest, and the full weight of everything she was and everything she was about to become, carried without pretense, without reduction, and without apology, into whatever came next. The ghost had left her a rifle. His daughter had learned what to do with it. And now the world was going to find out exactly what that meant.